In 1980, 22-year-old Dale Nancy Wyman lived on Washington Avenue in what was then the city of Vanier, Ontario. She had mentioned to some family members that she wanted to leave home because her father was abusive, but they did not expect her to leave without telling anyone where she was going, which she did on July 16, 1980. Around 11:45 that morning, she left home with a suitcase and hailed a cab to take her to a bus station on Catherine Street. She did not tell anyone where she was going, and her family never heard anything else from her. Police investigating her disappearance interviewed the main witness in the case, the taxi driver who picked up Dale and took her to the bus station. He told them that Dale had mentioned that she was not sure where she was traveling to, but she was considering Toronto or Montreal. He also said that when he went inside the bus terminal, after dropping Dale off to get a cup of coffee, he had seen Dale talking with two other young adults who have never been identified. Tips called into police placed Dale in Alberta in 1991 and Toronto in 1992, but the sightings were never substantiated. Dale's family received a phone call from a hospital in Saskatoon trying to locate the family of an individual in their care, but this did not lead them to Dale. This call did lead to retired RCMP officer Linda Davidson, who is now the director of an organization called Murdered Unidentified Cold Case Investigations, investigating hospital records and unidentified remains from this area, when she began working on the case as a private investigator decades later. In May of 2021, in honor of Dale's 63rd birthday, there was a new appeal to the public for information about the case. Police in Ottawa released a new age-progressed sketch of what Dale might look like, along with a video message recorded by Dale's sister, Brenda Larsh. In it, Brenda stated, "Dale is deeply missed by her brother and two sisters. Our hearts hold an empty space for her, and we pray and hope that someone may remember her in any way. Please help us to resolve this and find some peace and closure. Thank you. And God bless for any tips brought forward." Brenda also spoke directly to her sister in case she saw the message, saying that she loved her and wishing her a happy birthday. It would be this effort that would ultimately lead to the resolution of Dale's case. On August 10th, 2022, Ottawa police announced that a third party had eventually seen the age-progressed image of Dale and called to report that Dale had been living outside of Canada and had recently passed away. Ottawa Police's Missing Persons Unit followed up on the tip and was able to confirm the information. At the time, authorities did not release any further information about what had become of Dale. However, it was later disclosed that the third party who had called in was Dale's daughter. Dale had made a life for herself in Ohio, where she had a family. She passed away just 2 months before her daughter saw the age-progressed image and learned that she was a missing person, whose family had never given up the search for her. Dale's siblings are struggling to accept this new information, as well as the fact that Dale passed away just before they found her. Dale's daughter has been put in contact with her family in Canada. In May of 1990, 35-year-old Myrtle Brown needed some time away, so she traveled to New York City to visit her best friend. However, the trip proved to be anything but relaxing. While in the city, someone stole her purse, which held all of her money, her identification, and medication she used to treat her epilepsy. Myrtle called her mother back home to tell her about the robbery. She also mentioned that she was not feeling well and that she would have to find a hospital where she could obtain an emergency refill on her prescription. Myrtle's family never heard from her again. They reported her missing and went to New York, where they spent weeks visiting hospitals and police stations looking for her with no success. They had to return home without answers, and decades would pass with no information about what became of Myrtle. Myrtle's daughter Ebony, who was just 13 years old when her mother went missing, struggled with going through the milestones in her life without her mother, especially because she did not know for sure if her mother was absent from her life voluntarily or not. Myrtle's family would not receive any new information about her case for more than 30 years. In April of 2022, the month before the 32nd anniversary of Myrtle's disappearance, Myrtle's brother Robert was watching NBC's Nightly News with Lester Holt. The show aired a segment about a cold case squad working out of the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner to determine the identities of more than 1,200 unidentified sets of remains located in New York City over the course of the past several decades. During the segment, Robert saw one facial reconstruction that he believed looked like his sister. He decided to contact the unit to see if they could help him determine if the woman depicted in the reconstruction could be Myrtle. Dr. Angela Soler, the assistant director of forensic anthropology, and her team began looking into Myrtle's case. The woman in the reconstruction that initially inspired Robert to call was proven not to be Myrtle, but Dr. Soler and her team continued researching to see if Myrtle was in fact one of the unidentified individuals in their caseload. Using Myrtle's physical details and the timing of her disappearance, the team was able to identify a potential match after more than 2 months of work. Dr. Soler notified Robert and Ebony about the potential match over a phone call. To see if they were correct, the team had to send them a photograph of an unidentified individual taken after they had passed away. When Ebony and Robert saw the photograph, they were able to confirm that the woman was Myrtle. 32 years after Myrtle went missing, her family finally learned the details of what had happened to her. Myrtle had suffered a seizure while waiting in the emergency room at Kings County Hospital and passed away. However, she died during a brief period of bureaucratic limbo that prevented her from being quickly identified and her family from being notified of her death. She had not yet registered with or been admitted to the hospital, so when her family searched for her, there was not a record of her being a patient there. Since her purse had been stolen, she had no identification with her when she died. Internal records do show that she did provide her name and date of birth to the hospital when she arrived to the emergency room, which helped the cold case unit identify her more than 30 years later. The Brown family was able to hold a virtual memorial for Myrtle after she was identified. They say that they now have peace, knowing what happened to Myrtle. Paul McGinty was from Montcharles in County Donegal, Ireland. He was one of 9 children. Like many Irish men, he moved to England for work in the 1960s. He lived for a time in London before moving to Coventry and supporting himself by working on building sites. Paul, then aged 51, was going through a difficult time in 1991 as he was out of work. He was able to pay the rent he owed before he suddenly went missing on April 8th, leaving all of his belongings behind. Paul's friends had tried to get local authorities to investigate his disappearance, but police did not take an interest in the case. While he no longer lived near them, Paul had still been in contact with his family back in Ireland. His sister Eileen saw him in person for the last time in 1987, when he came home to attend their brother's funeral. They would call each other for Christmas and Easter, and a few times in between each year. When she called the home where he had been staying one day in 1991, his landlord informed her that Paul had gone missing. Eileen would be the only one of Paul's siblings to live long enough to see his disappearance solved more than 30 years later. On April 18, 1991, a man's body was found in Bracetown, County Mead. Foul play was not suspected in his death, but the man had no identification on him, and since his identity was unknown, his next of kin could not be notified of his death. The man had been seen around the county in the week previous, talking with locals at a pub and attending a Gaelic Athletic Association match, but no one who had seen or interacted with him knew his name. He had looked disheveled and had been living as a transient once he arrived in the area. The man's body was photographed, as were his belongings, including the gray herringbone coat he had been found wearing and the St. Christopher medal he carried with him. 7 months of investigation did not uncover the man's identity. He was then buried in a grave marked only by a small stone in St. Mary's Cemetery in Navan. A renewed effort to learn the unidentified man's identity began in 2021. His remains were exhumed in hopes of collecting a DNA sample, but things did not go according to plan. Forensic Science Ireland ultimately concluded that a usable DNA sample could not be collected, which can sometimes happen based on circumstances during the exhumation, or the extent or nature of how the bones had degraded. Investigators then turned to the other evidence they had in an effort to solve the case. The man's body had been discovered within a day or two of his death, meaning it had not yet decomposed very much, so the photographs investigators took of his body at the time it was found gave a good idea of what the man had looked like in life. Because the photographs were such high quality, they were sent to a forensic artist who drew an image of what the man would have looked like before his death. This image was subsequently shown on the RTE television program Crime Call in hopes that someone would recognize him. A man named Michael Leonard happened to be watching the program the night it aired in his home in County Donegal. He nearly fell out of his chair when he saw the artist's rendering on the screen, as he immediately recognized it as Paul McGinty. Michael had met Paul decades earlier when Paul and Michael's brother John worked together in Coventry. John had seen Paul just the day before he disappeared. Other members of the Leonard family had met Paul as well, and they had all never forgotten him, wondering what had become of him in the decades after he disappeared. When Michael told the other members of his family about the composite image, they all also recognized it as Paul upon seeing it. Michael then went to see Paul's sister Eileen to show her the image, and she too immediately recognized it as her brother. She went to the authorities to begin the process of confirming the identification. In November of 2022, a coroner's inquest was held in Mead Coroner's Court, outlining the details of the case and formally identifying the previously unidentified man found in April of 1991 as Paul McGinty. It is unknown what brought Paul to County Mead, as he had no known ties there. His lone surviving sibling, his sister Eileen, who is now in her 80s, was able to attend the inquest and see her brother's case officially solved after more than 3 decades.